In a time of visual saturation, creative people sometimes approach me for clarity, a sharper focus, and a clearer definition of what they're doing. But I do not see clarity, and therefore I cannot communicate it. Too much clarity can lead to too many rules, with a danger of constriction and stifled growth. You know, we have all this talk about living in a contemporary renaissance, and I feel like we have the potential to be living in one, but if it's going to happen, we need a new description of what we're doing, and just as importantly, why we are doing it. As a photo designer, I'd rather show you than tell you. I'm interested in doing something and not defining, and in capturing rather than contemplating. However, just be warned, my work is a guide to something that's still not entirely clear to me yet, because I feel like we do what we know almost before we know what we do. I take photos, but I almost have instinctively avoided the title of photographer. I had, and I still have, this fear of being pigeonholed or being caught up in the word. And honestly, at times I felt like I hadn't earned it. I'd rather not say too much about my life, but in short, my parents, who are here, Catherine and Cahill, they're Irish immigrants, and I was born and raised in Queens, New York, and I dropped out of NYU at the end of the first semester of my junior year. But I hate to break it to you, if a diploma is not necessarily a credential in today's world, then neither is dropping out. All that time, I thought of myself as someone who worked on photos, who in the meantime took photos. You know, when I was younger, I really wanted to be able to contribute to the world of commercial advertising. It was so fascinating and exciting, the idea of one day landing a photo on a big billboard or a magazine cover. Commercial satire was this ongoing series that I created where I would concept and shoot fake ads and use them to build a portfolio for the type of work that I hoped I could one day do for real brands and companies. And these are some of my favorite fake ads that I made during that time. You know, I thought of myself as someone who worked on photos, who in the meantime took photos. I made up the term photo designer as a joke, and I would use it sarcastically on my Instagram, like, oh, well, if he's not a photographer, he's a photo designer. Well, I didn't really start using it in a serious way until I realized people were taking me seriously. They didn't really get the joke, and after a while, I kind of forgot the punchline myself. They would reach out and thank me for creating a term they felt they could finally relate to. The title, they told me, expressed something new in advertising and marketing, something imperfect and undefined. It really looks back to what I consider to be the heyday of advertising in the 90s, where commercial work was more carefully considered, but it also suggested a coming era where the photo designer is the artist who pays special attention to the craft of photography and the particular power of advertising. A photo designer establishes a vision and pursues that vision through all levels of making the photograph, from concepting and sketching and scouting and styling and casting and designing the set and lighting it and actually shooting it in the post-production. Basically everything. And behind me are some of my favorite works that I made when I was first doing photo designer work. You know, for me, the term photographer is at the same time too narrow and too expansive, because everyone is a photographer behind their iPhones. And honestly, let me get everyone smile. And that's fine, but I feel like fewer and fewer of us photographers count against the high standard of the medium's history and the contemporary flood of images. I want to take what I find useful from the old ways, try to concentrate the medium and even out the difference between the number and quality of images. As I continue on using this new term photo designer, it has come to serve a neat and particular function, and I hope for it to one day grow and blossom into what I see as a new genre for the artist of photo design. Ultimately, though, I feel like deciding on a title is like procrastinating. Me, personally, I really just want to make cool images. The name is besides the point. It's about what you do. So as I begin to describe my experience as a photo designer, try to develop your own impression and don't get caught up in a title. The start of a given photo is honestly never really clear, and it's constantly changing as I go throughout it. But I can recognize one of the first stages when, say, I'm inspired by some indistinct idea from a company or a friend or whoever. It starts with me filling notebooks and setting down loose associations and watching YouTube videos or listening to music and flipping through my favorite photo books. Basically anything that I feel like can keep that feeling of inspiration alive. I work really hard to maintain a sensitivity to this strange but powerful feeling. And it's more so a willingness to be guided by vague impulse. I really don't know what else to call this feeling, so I've been calling it magic. Magic is not about content, it's about a feeling. It's not about a particular experience, it's about the feeling consistent across experiences. You know, the experience of magic doesn't have to be as showy as a magician pulling a rabbit out of a hat. I've found that it can be felt in something much simpler, much more normal, something in your everyday life. And this is the feeling that I strive for in my work. Magic is something like inspiration, or maybe it's the source of inspiration's power. I'm still not quite sure. And it's difficult to define because it's something that you have to feel. And it's hard to get out with words, and honestly, I'm not really that good with words. I'm more of a visual person. You know, especially at these early stages of creating, we should allow ourselves to be driven by this abstract feeling, without strict definitions or abstract sanctions. More concretely, though, I'll begin to gather references and study the precedents set by artists across all mediums, looking at the color, the tone, the lighting, the lenses if it's a photograph, and so on. I have, for example, set so many of my pictures against this masterpiece by one of my favorite photographers, David LaChapelle. This encapsulates what I aspire to do because it feels like LaChapelle captured an era, transcending the particular subject. I often ask myself, how can I make my next image as powerful as one like that? Craft. Craft is the answer. You might define the photo designer's craft as all of the more necessary and hands-on work in the logistical and more technical parts of pre-production, shooting, and post-production that, once attended to, can make the photograph possible. Craft is the infrastructure that can concretize the moment of inspiration, turn it visual, and make it real. The exactitude of craft doesn't contradict the strangeness of magic. It actually complements it and allows for it. So when I start to feel like the vision is becoming halfway clear, I begin to draw up a shitty sketch. Sketching is a stage of discovery because it gives me an idea of what works, or just as importantly, what doesn't work. And I have to give credit to my good friend and fellow artist, Steven Savoca, for introducing me to the necessity of getting everything down on paper. And the sketches behind me are next to photographs that have come out of them. You know, the sketch grounds the whole thing, and it orients me and the team that I'm working with. The rough style is comforting, and it makes a far-off vision feel more attainable. When the vision is too new, it exists too abstractly. And I've often found that using a simple reference image in describing what I want is never clear enough, because things get lost in communication, miscommunicated, and so on. Everything works in combination, though. These sketches are really effective at breaking down the barriers of overplanning, because I feel like if it works in the sketch, then it's really just between you and the craft to be able to bring it to life as a photograph. Now, whether I'm shooting behind the scenes at a concert, or an album cover, or a campaign, or just a personal project, careful attention to the craft is essential to making images that will last beyond the fickle cycle of trends and seasons. I'm describing my process to emphasize that for me, attention to the approach is just as important as the result. There is no magic without craft, and innovation should not be artificially tacked on at the end of a project like a good job sticker. I feel like it must appear again and again and again at each stage of making an image, from the sketch to the finished photograph. But, you know, there's truly no one right way. There's no single way to light a photo that's good, or no final rule for how a given lens should be used. There's a limit to advice. So at a certain point, you kind of just have to start the craft and feel it out. Even though a photograph is instant, I personally see no reason why it should be any simpler than painting a painting, or composing a song. In angling the strobe to shape the light or dressing the set to build a scene, consistent attention to the craft is how I've made any authentic images. At their best, photographs are worthy of attention, and a serious picture can sustain and reward your attention. You know, the photo designer's purpose also extends to cultivating an environment on set and making it possible allowing it so that magic can be possible. When I was shooting this album cover, it kind of reminds me of the first time when I experienced magic on set, and it's really like the only way that I can describe it. But this isn't limited to photo design. Attention to craft can be applied across all art forms, activities, and really any kind of work. But I feel like it's consistently lacking in both modern advertising and imagery in general. A closer look at one image might be helpful in here what I've been trying to say. This is a sketch that I made for one of the first big commercial projects where I was trusted with directing the whole vision. This sketch represents what I aimed at to be a fully practical, in-camera build with every single one of these items hung by hand to appear as if they were floating in the room. In the months of our pre-production calls, this image stood out as one of the most complicated, and we did 13 images for this campaign. You know, we had to build a room and bring in a stunt coordinator and meticulously hang these 40 color-coordinated objects on a 5-layer C-stand plane, just to name a few things. The brand that I was working with was looking at the logistical ideal of inserting plates with Photoshop and post-production. Or basically, they didn't actually want to have all of these items in the room hanging there. They thought it would be easier to take the photograph and add everything afterwards. And honestly, it probably would have been. And my good friend and trusted set designer, Greg Yarrow, who's actually here, told me that it could be done in camera. He said it would be very difficult, very, very difficult to be able to do this in camera. But it could be done. So that was it. It had to be done in camera. If we were to execute this concept, we would need to do it authentically and with a photo designer's attention to craft. Now, by authenticity, I do not mean a photograph that is the truth. I mean one that is true to a vision and that pursues magic through craft. I've often found that too much management and too much backloading in post-production makes for a hollow representation, creating something that's lacking a real feeling or sentiment. I told a brand, whose name I'm actually not allowed to mention right now, that if you want to sell the idea of just do it, we have to actually do it. And we did do it. And this is the photograph. And where there aren't the means for an elaborate in-camera build like this, you need to simplify and innovate. This image here on the left is a photo that I took in my room a few years earlier, just on my own accord, destroyed my childhood bedroom, my poor mother. And this photograph here on the right is a photograph that I took for this big commercial campaign, and it feels like a direct reference and influence for what I was trying to do a few years earlier. You see, this photograph, like all photographs, are simply just a record of light. So, in my mind, for something to remain as authentic as possible, all elements of the photograph need to be physically present, dressed in light in front of you. In the end, all elements of this photograph were physically present, and nothing was added in post-production. And here's some behind-the-scenes footage. But whether something is in camera or it's Photoshop beyond recognition, the best work will be work that can humble itself before craft and crowd. In our time, it feels like advertising is one of the art forms with the most potential to be able to communicate to everybody and convey this feeling of magic on a large scale. Against disembodied technologies, the actual world that we live in is still adorned with beauty. Think of the physical process of wheat pasting or installing a billboard. Or take this project I started last summer in New York City. It's a coffee cart, hand-built by my good friend and my brother, Cian, who's also here. And you see, the coffee cart seeks to bring people back to reality through the most literal sense, through a physical meeting ground. Now, listen, the coffee is great, but it really has nothing to do with the coffee. You see, the cart and these images set up on the street and on our screens, these are things that we live around. I take every photograph with the idea of inspiring the random viewer as they walk by or flip through their screens or flip through the pages of a magazine. In a commercial setting, photography as art has the ability to reach and communicate to a nearly infinite number of people. Virtually everything is advertising nowadays. We are constantly being advertised to, if you haven't noticed. Advertisements even influence the language that we use to talk to ourselves. Through attention to craft, the photo designer is particularly poised to use the techniques of advertising for the level and quality of more traditional art photography, but with a reach beyond the museums and out of the galleries and into the real world. I aim at magic in the real world. Traditionally, a commercial photographer has been in a position of influence, influencing contemporaries or propping up influencers who will populate and build this carefully planned out future. But I feel like if this new renaissance is really going to happen, then the era of influence has to end. As a photo designer, I want to trade influence for inspiration. Quality will beat any algorithm any day of the week, because when it comes to it, you can't trick people into thinking you're authentic. They have to feel it. You know what? Forget the speech. I just hope for my work to enter into your everyday life and inspire you in your own craft, whatever it is. But it will always be true that form without a function is waste, and that aesthetic without purpose is simply just vanity. Thank you.